His partner shrugged. Okay, so you set the cryocap to wake you up a week out from home, then... Norton shook his head. Can't be done. The cryocaps are individually coded at nano-level for each passenger, and they've got very rigid program parameters. They'd reject a different body out of hand. You'd need to be a cryogen biotech specialist to get around that, and even then you probably couldn't do it mid-transit. That kind of coding gets done while the ship's in dock. They take the whole system down to do it. And you wouldn't be able to recode an early wake-up either, for much the same reason. The whole point of what happened here is that it was all within the existing parameters of the automated systems. There's programmed provision for bringing a passenger temporarily out of cryogen for medical procedures. There is no provision for swapping passengers around or letting them wake up early. And he was smart enough or skilled enough to know that, said Sevgi. Think about that. He knew exactly which systems he could safely subvert, and he did it without tripping a single alarm in the process. Yeah. And he's a mean hand at alternative cuisine, growled Coyle. Your point is? My point is, anyone with the skills and strengths this man has shown would have gone out on a Qualpro tour, which means a 3 to 5 year gig, no requirement to renew. He could have waited, come home cryocapped and comfortably wealthy. Sevgi looked around at them. Why didn't he? Rovayo shrugged. Maybe he couldn't do the time. 3 years is a long stretch when you're looking at it from the starting line. Ask the new fish up at Folsom or Quentin too, and that's just jail time here on Earth. Maybe this guy gets off the shuttle at Bradbury, takes one look at all those red rocks and realizes he made a big mistake. He just can't go through with it. That doesn't fit with the force of will he'd need to do this, said Norton soberly. No, it doesn't, Sevgi agreed. And anyway, he could have called in the rescue ships as soon as he was outside the Mars support envelope. He didn't. Support envelope? Rovayo frowned inquiry at Norton. What's that? Norton nodded. Works like this. If you launch a call-in transport from Mars to Earth and something goes wrong, something that requires a rescue, then it's only worth the Mars people coming out up to a certain point. After that point, the transport is so far along the trajectory it would make more sense to send help from the Earth end. Anyone wanting to get home would have to wait at least until the tip-over point. Otherwise, it's all for nothing. Mars Rescue brings you back and you're still stuck there, with whatever penalties Colin chooses to enforce on top. You need the rescue to come from Earth, because that way, whatever else happens to you, you've at least made it home. They're not going to waste the payload cost on sending you back again just out of spite. Just out of curiosity, said Coyle. What are those penalties you're talking about? What do Colin do to you if you step out of line on Mars? Norton shuttled another glance at Sevgi. She shrugged. It works the same as anywhere else, Norton said with trained care. They'd all been drilled in acceptable presentation on this one, too. There's a suite of sanctions called contractual constraint, but it's what you'd expect, the usual stuff. Financial penalties set against your contract, incarceration in some serious cases. If you're a short-timer, your jail time gets added onto the contract length without compensation. So if you're homesick, it doesn't pay to act up. Yeah, Rovayo cranked an eyebrow. And if you do make it back to Earth? Unauthorized, I mean? Norton hesitated. Sevgi said it for him. That's never been done before. And she wondered vaguely why she was smiling as she spoke. Cold, hard little smile. Ethan stood there in her memory and grinned back at her. Oh-ho, said Coyle. What, never? Rovayo again. In 30 years this has never happened before? 32 years, said Norton. Over twice that if you count the original bubble cruise back before the nanoforming really kicked in. Like Sevgi says, it's a closed system. Very hard to beat. Coyle shook his head. I still don't get it. He could have called in a rescue from the Earth end. Okay, he'd maybe do some time, but Jesus fuck, he did the time anyway out there. How much worse could white-collar jail time be than that? But he wasn't looking at just white-collar sentence, said Sevgi softly. Look, Coyle wasn't listening to her. He was still looking for somewhere to dump his anger. "What I still don't get is this. Why didn't you people send out the rescue ship on spec as soon as the N-Jin went down?"
"Too fucking cheap is why," muttered Revayo.
"Because there wasn't any point," Sevgi said evenly. "Horkin's Pride was coming home anyway. As far as we knew, the crew were unharmed." "Unfucking-harmed?" Coyle again, disbelieving. Norton stepped into the breach. "Yeah, I know how that sounds, but you've got to understand how this works. It was only the N-Jin that stopped talking to us. That's happened before on the Mars run. We just don't like to publicize the fact. We've had cases where the Jin goes offline temporarily, then blips back on a few days later. Sometimes they just die. We don't really know why." He spanned an invisible cube with both hands, chopped downward. Sevgi looked elsewhere, face kept carefully immobile. "The point is, it doesn't matter that much. The ship will run fine on automated modular systems. Think of the N-Jin as the captain of a ship. If the captain on one of those Pacific factory rafts dies, you don't have to send out a salvage vessel to bring the raft into port, do you?" A self-deprecatory smile at the rhetorical question. Same thing with Horkin's Pride. Losing the N-Jin didn't affect the ship's fail-safe protocols. Mars and Earth traffic control were both still getting the standard green lights from Horkin's Pride. Shipboard atmosphere and rotational gravity constant, no hull breaches, cryocap systems all online, trajectory uncompromised, pilot systems active. The baseline machines were all still working, it's just the ship itself that wouldn't talk to us.
Revayo shook her head.
"And the fact that this hijo de puta was taking people out of the cryocaps and cutting them up, that didn't register anywhere?" "No," admitted Norton tiredly. "No, it didn't. Without the Jin, there was no way to know what was going on." Sevgi droned on, partly bored, partly trying to bury her own grim conviction that Revayo had guessed right about Colin's real motives. Mid-trajectory retrieval was still a mind-numbingly expensive call for any flight project manager to make. The baseline system is exactly what it sounds like. It tells us if something malfunctions. There was no visible malfunction, and since the whole crew was supposed to be in cryocap, that meant, logically, there was no way for them to be harmed. We had no way of knowing any different, and the ship was on course. In a situation like that, you wait. That's how spaceflight works.
Revayo took the tutorial edge on the last comment without blinking.
"Yeah? Well, if the ship wasn't talking to you, how was it going to dock at the nano-rack?"
Norton spread his hands. "Same answer. Autonomic engagement. The docking facility takes over from the pilot systems on approach. We had no reason to think that wouldn't happen."
"Seems to me," said Coyle, "whoever did this knew your systems inside out."
"Yes, they did. And our miserable cost-cutting souls, too."
Sevgi shook off the thought. Time to get back on track. "They knew our systems because they'd studied them, and they were highly skilled at planning an intrusion into those systems, which means a high degree of raw intelligence and insurgency training. And they were utterly committed to their own survival above and beyond any other concern, which takes an extreme degree of strength and mental discipline. And yet this same person was so terrified of being registered on arrival that they did this to avoid it."
Sevgi gestured around the virtuality. Aspects of the crime leapt out at them as the systems read focus in the wake of her sweeping arm. Outraged data, cut and splice code wounding marked in siren colors, frozen footage snaps of cryocap fluids spilled across pristine floors, blood spotted on walls, and stripped skull grins. She drew a deep breath.
"Now, does anyone want to tell me what those pixels paint?"
She wasn't that far ahead of them. Coyle's eyes changed with the understanding. Anger finally damped down to something else. Revayo went very still. Norton, Sevgi twisted to meet his eyes, just looked thoughtful. But no one said anything. Oddly, it was the Path face that took up the challenge. It thought it had been asked a question.
"The salients you describe," the confected woman said precisely,
are consistent with the perpetrator being a Variant 13 re-engineered male. Sevgi nodded her thanks at the face. Yes, aren't they just? They all stood there while it sank in.
Great, said Coyle finally. Just what we need. A fucking twist for a perp.
Chapter 6. The humidity loop on string 17 went down sometime on Friday night, they figured, and once again the backup protectives failed to come online. Saturday came in foggy, so at first no one noticed when the dish covers stayed dialed up to full transparency. But when the California summer sun finally burned through the fog that afternoon and hit the glass, the incubating cultures got it full force. Sirens cut loose back at the wharf. Scott and Wren roared out there at panic speed in the Zodiac, but by the time they got into their wetsuits and into the water, they'd lost pretty much everything on the string. They paddled about a bit, making sure, disconnected the system, and phoned the detail in to Emil Nocera. Then they powered back to the wharf in glum and dripping silence. Scott didn't need to voice what they both knew. 17 was loaded to the roots. It had about a quarter of the month's crop on it. When Ulysses Ward got back from checking the deep trellis range and heard about this, he was going to go ballistic. It was the third time that summer.
What happens when you buy your software out of fucking Texas? Grinned Nocera, feet up on the console while he and Scott sat waiting for some hired down-the-wires San Diego machine consultancy to trace and fix the fault. Ward's never going to learn. You want rim quality, you gotta pay rim prices.
It's not the software, Scott said, mainly because he knew it wasn't, but also because he was getting tired of Nocera's constant cracks. It's the seals.
It fucking is the software. Ward got cheap and cheerful from a bunch of Jesus-land hicks, probably think altered carbon's what you buy for indoor barbecues. Those guys are running 5 years behind the stuff coming out of the valley now, minimum.
There's nothing wrong with the software, Scott snapped. We had this same shit back in May, and that was before the fucking upgrade.
Before you hired on, he didn't add. And then his own language caught up with him and he coloured with the shame. He'd never sworn like that before he started working out here. Yeah, same shit software. Nocera wasn't going to shut up. He was on a roll. He gestured around the con room. Ward buys his upgrades the same place he got the original system, Caltech, Kansas. Shat fresh out of a longhorn's ass.
You said Texas a minute ago.
Texas? Kansas? Nocera made a dismissive gesture. In the end, what's the fucking difference? It's all...
Leave him alone, Emil. We all got to be born somewhere.
Carmen Wren stood in the doorway of the control room, unlit spliff tucked into the corner of her mouth and hands in her coverall pockets. She'd stomped off as soon as she'd peeled off her wetsuit without a backward word. Scott knew by now not to go after her when she hit that mood, not till she'd smoked it down a little, leastways. Nocera sighed weightily. Look, Carm, it's not like that. I don't get on Osborne here just 'cause he's a fence hopper. A lot of people would around here, but not me. I figure a man's got to make a living, even if he has to tunnel under a fence line to do it. But he's not going to sit here and tell me that cheap crap they spin up in Jesus-land works as well as Rimtech. Because it just ain't fucking so.
Wren gave Scott a weary smile. Ignore him, she said. With Ward out of sight, there's no telling how much custom nasty shit Emil here's put up his nose today.
Nocera wagged a cautionary finger at her. You pick your chemicals, Carm, I'll pick mine.
This? Wren removed the spliff from her mouth and held it aloft for general scrutiny. This is a cheap drug, Emil. I won't be the one coming around begging for a sub the week before payday.
Hey, fuck you.
She put the spliff back in her mouth, crushed the end to life between a calloused thumb and forefinger, and drew hard. The ember flared up with a clearly audible, splintering crack. She sighed out a cloud of smoke, looked at Nocera through it for a moment. Thanks, she said. I've had better offers this week.
What, like from Altar Boy here?
Scott felt himself flush again, hot on hot. Carmen Wren was the most gorgeous woman he'd ever seen in the flesh, and since they'd been on field maintenance together, he'd been seeing a lot of that flesh. She stripped off in the tackle room with an utter lack of self-consciousness that he knew Pastor William would have called prideful and unwomanly. Scott politely turned his back whenever she got naked that way, but he still caught glimpses as she zipped herself into the wetsuit or peeled unexpectedly to the waist in the Zodiac when it was hot. Her skin was like pale honey, and the curves of her body were subtle yet unmistakable, even in the shapeless Ward Biosupply coveralls they all wore around the wharf. But more than all that, Carmen Wren had long, straight hair that spilled like black water onto her shoulders whenever she unpinned it from the spider-form static clip that kept it up, and a curious, negligent way of tipping her head to one side as she did it. She had liquid, dark, ironic eyes that lifted delicately at the corners, and cheekbones like ledges on some Himalayan peak, and when she concentrated on something, her whole face took on a porcelain immobility that splintered his heart like the sound of that ember in the spliff. The last few weeks, Scott had found himself thinking about Wren a lot when he went home at nights, and in a way that he knew was sinful. He'd done his best to resist the urges, but it was no good. She floated into his dreams unbidden, in postures and scenarios that made him flush when he recalled them during the waking day. More than once recently he'd woken tight and hard from the dreams, his hands already on himself and the taste of Wren's name in his mouth. Worse still, he had the feeling that when Wren looked at him, she could see right through him to that sweaty core of desire, and despised him for it. Now she was smoking, looking down on Nocera as if he were something that had just leaked out of the mulch vats. "You really are being a disagreeable little prick today, aren't you?" She turned to Scott. "You want to go get a coffee up on the wharf?" With you? Together, you mean?" Scott bounced to his feet as she nodded. "Sure, yeah, great." With, you?" Nocera sneered, made dying insect-leg motions with his arms, cranked up a joke Jesus-land accent from network comedy stock. Darling, how can I refuse such a lady? Praise the ever-loving Lord." Scott felt his fists clench. He'd been in enough scuffles back home to know he wasn't much of a fighter, and to know from looking at Nocera that he was. He'd seen the scars when the older man was getting into and out of a wetsuit, read it also in stance and the blank challenge of the unkind eyes. It was like looking at a later edition of Jack Mackenzie's older brother, the one who'd enlisted on his 16th birthday and come home a year later, sunburned and full of scalp tales from places none of them had ever heard of. Still, he'd taken about as much of Nocera's rim superiority as he... Wren glided into the gap almost before Scott realized he was turning to face the other man. "I said a coffee, Scott, not a broken nose." She nodded at the door. "Come on, leave this dickhead to play with himself." "Be a lot more fun than playing with you, Wren." Nocera leaned past Wren's hip, still in his chair, still grinning. "I'm telling you, kid, I know her sort, inside out. Been there, eaten the pussy. You will have more fun jerking off." Scott surged forward, fists raised. The new flush slammed through him, itching at the roots of his hair and burning across his cheeks. He saw the grin slide off Nocera's face, replaced with a sudden, speculative interest. The other man's boots swung unhurriedly off the console to the floor. Scott knew then he was going to get a kicking, but fuck it. And suddenly he was pressed up against Wren. Flash scent of her hair, still damp, warmth of skin and soft curves right underneath his eyes, and then she pushed him firmly back toward the door. The look on her face wasn't friendly. "Get out," she said, firm as the hand on his chest. "Wait for me upstairs." He went, stumbling a little, shame and relief pulsing through him in about equal quantities. The door closed behind him, shutting down whatever Nocera was sneering to a barely audible murmur. Wren's angry tones trod it down. He wanted to stay and listen, but... He went quietly along the bulb-lit metal corridor, up the clanking metal steps to the topside offices, and out into the late afternoon sunlight, still breathing tightly. He crossed to the rail on one of the wharf's access gantries and gripped the carbon fibre weave in both fists as if he could crush it. He stared down at his whitened knuckles. Fucking Nocera. Fucking rim assholes. Fucking place. But he'd known. A small, calm part of himself came and reminded him. He'd always known what it was going to be like. He'd known because Uncle Wallace, who'd been rimside before he was born, had told him all about it. Pastor William had told him too, in bitten-off, hellfire-tinged terms. His mother had wept and told him again and again. His friends had jeered and told him. Everyone had told him, because everyone knew what they thought of Republicans out on the godless rim. Hard grind and hatred, it was all they'd offer him. They'd use him up, spit on him while they were doing it, and if the immigration bogies didn't get him, then debt and the gangmasters would. He'd have no rights there, no one to turn to. He'd been nothing, worse than nothing, one of the silent service underclass that were cheaper than machines and had to be as quiet, as uncomplaining and efficient, or else bang, your average high-tech, high-demand rim citizen there just went right ahead and junked them for something that'd do the job faster, cheaper, better. "Still, I won't tell you not to go." Wallace, the last week before Scott skipped, parked by Scott's side on the split-rail fence, watching sunset smear the sky up over the mountains. He didn't know it, but Scott had already paid the handler in Bozeman the up-front half. He was due on the truck next Tuesday. "I won't tell you not to go, because there's nothing here for you that's better. People hate the rim, and there's a pot of good reasons for that, but there'll be chances out there you won't get here if you stay your whole God-given life. The money hasn't settled like it has here. It's still moving. It's not all classed up and fossilized. You can track it out there, go where it is. Get lucky, you can maybe carve some off for yourself. And if you stay, get legal, get a family, then your kids can maybe have even more. You know, schooling's free in the rim. I mean really free. And real schooling, not the bull crap we get here." They'd sat for a while, and evening had deepened the colors of the sunset. The air started to chill. "Why'd you come back then, Wallace?" he'd finally asked. Wallace grinned and looked down at his work-worn hands. "You always ask the good ones, Scotty. Why'd I come back? I don't know, maybe I just wasn't strong enough to stay away. I missed this place, something grim, you know. We both did, me and your pop. We always talked about coming back, and I think that's what helped us stay away. Then when Daniel had his accident, there was no more talk. No one to talk to. And that missing started to really gnaw at me." Scott knew the gnawing well. Sometimes he beat it, for days at a time, especially in the early days, the early shit jobs when work wore him down and left him no strength or time for anything but itself and sleep. But the longing always came back, and now he had time and money put away. He could feel the same crumbling that must have taken Wallace. He said his prayers every night, the way he'd promised Mum he would, went to a Christian church when he could find one. But lately he was confused in the things he thought about praying for. "You okay now?" He started. He hadn't heard Wren come up behind him. "Where I come from," he said tightly, straight off, "you don't talk that way in front of women." She inclined her head, gave him a gentle smile. "Well, where I come from we don't segregate our speech, but thanks anyway. It was a nice thought, especially since Nocera would have walked all over you. He's an asshole, Scott, but that doesn't mean he can't handle himself. I know that. I seen his type before. Have you?" She examined him closely for a moment, raised an eyebrow. "Yeah, you have, haven't you? Well then, that was a very brave thing you tried to do." He felt the bloom of something inside, felt it wither again as Wren shook her head at him. "Pretty fucking dumb, but very brave. Shall we go and get that coffee?" Ward Biosupply had begun life as one of several marine biotech startups working off the Quok Commercial Wharf Complex, but over time it had absorbed a lot of the neighboring competition and now sprawled across the north end of the complex in a patchwork collection of office prefabs, scaffolded sub-docks, and newly built warehousing. To find anything that didn't belong to Ulysses Ward, you had to walk one of the narrow linking gantries over to the south side, where a run of eateries with sea views catered to the wharf's workers. They ducked into a place called Chung's, which was widely reckoned to be the best of the caffeine joints, and had a set of displays running club footage from the Singapore bloodbeat scene. "This is good," Wren said, gesturing at the screens with her coffee mug. "Beats that saccharine shit they pipe in on sight."
Yeah, gruffly. He was still smarting a little from her calling him dumb, besides which he quite liked the on-site music, and he didn't really approve of the massed, writhing bodies rubbing up against one another's all but nakedness. She drank, nodded appreciatively at the taste. Yeah, be good to be caffeinated too, come to that. If Ward's going to shout at us, I want to be awake when he does it. I've been up since 4 this morning. Doing what? She shrugged. You know how it is. By which he knew she meant she had another job, and was therefore illegal like him, because out here if you were legitimate you'd get by pretty easily on a single wage. It was the stand-out difference between the Rim and the Republic. The hint of solidarity softened his sulk. Things'll smooth out when you've been here a while, he offered in return. I was working every open-eye hour, 3 different places, till I hooked this gig. Ward likes to run his mouth when things go wrong, but he's a pretty good boss under that. She nodded. I guess things must have been pretty grim where you're from, right? She said shrewdly. Where is that? I'm guessing Nebraska? The Dakotas, maybe? Montana. She raised an eyebrow. What a war country. Man, that must have been tough growing up. They got it worse in other places, he said defensively, though he couldn't have named any offhand. Just, well, you know, hard to get paying work. You don't know the right people. She nodded. Plus ça change. Excuse me? Doesn't matter. She watched the screens. Ward say anything to you about when he'd be back? Not really. Said it might be most of the day. I figure he's got to be aiming on some serious overhaul work. Usually a trip like that, trellis check, he'd be out and back in not much more than a couple of hours. He hesitated. Carmen, you mind if I ask you a question? Sure. It was said absently. She wasn't really paying attention. Where are you from? Sudden, sidelong glance. Now he had her attention. That's a long story, Scott. She sipped her coffee. You sure you want to be that bored? I won't be. I like hearing about places I haven't been. Makes you think I'm from someplace else? But she grinned as she said it, in a way that said he was supposed to join in. He grinned back, flushing only a little. Come on, Carmen. You wouldn't be working for Ward if you were Rim born and bred. None of us would. He nodded around at the clientele, dropped his voice a prudent couple of notches. Everyone in this place is from someplace else. I don't figure you for any different. She raised an eyebrow. Detective, huh? I just pay attention, he said. Yeah, I guess you do. So come on, tell me, where'd you swing in from? There was a long pause. Scott waited. He'd had these moments before with fellow illegals, the weightless gap before trust engaged, before each one shed the load of suspicion and talked together like 2 free Americans once would have done, back before the internationalist scum and the Chinese, political Chinese, he reminded himself, you're not a racist, Scott, broke apart the greatest nation on the face of the earth and cast down the fractured remnants like Moses breaking the tablets. Taiwan, she said, and his heart welled up with the knowledge that, yes, she did trust him. You heard of Taiwan? Right, I mean, sure, falling over himself in eagerness. That's in China, right? It's like a Chinese province. Ren snorted. They fucking wish. It's an island and it's off the coast of China, you got that right. But we're an independent state, written that way into every Pacific Rim trade agreement and non-proliferation pact in the last 100 years. What you call a hothouse economy, same status as the Angeline Freeport. Same hyper-powered output and no one wants to fuck with it in case they break it and the whole Rim feels the backwash. That's where I grew up. So why'd you leave? She gave him a sharp look, for all it had been an innocent question. Scott couldn't see leaving a place that was doing that well for any reason on earth, not if it was your home, not if you grew up there. I mean, he stumbled, I guess you weren't happy there, right? But, you know, it sounds like the kind of place a person would be happy. She smiled a little. Well, it has its upsides. But even in hothouse economies, you got losers as well as winners. I mean, not everyone in the Freeport's a movie star or a nanotech licensee, right? Got that right. It was heartfelt. He'd worked in the Freeport, on and off. would never go back if he didn't have to. Okay, so, like I said, winners and losers. If you're the loser, then... You don't want to talk like that, Carmen. Scott leaned across the table, earnest. You're not a loser just on account of you got to go somewhere else to make a better life for yourself. None of us is a loser here. We're just looking for that opportunity to get back on the horse. For a moment it got a blank look. Then the confusion cleared from her porcelain face. Ah, right. Culture gap. No, I'm not talking about losers the way you people do. I mean losers in the trade-off. Some win, some lose. The wheel goes round. That kind of thing. You people? He tried to hide the hurt. What do you mean, you people? You know, guys like you. She gestured impatiently. Old Americans, heartlanders from the Republic. Oh, okay. But look, Carmen. He allowed himself a superior smile. We're not the old Americans. That's the Union, that sellout Eastern scum, all their UN-loving pals. The Confederated Republic is the new America. We're the Phoenix Rising, Carm. Right. I mean, He stumbled again, looking for language that wouldn't offend. Look, I know probably you didn't go to a church the same way I always did. Guess for you it was some kind of temple or something, but in the end it's the same thing, right? Pleased with himself for the way he'd eased out from under Pastor William's unremitting hell-fire and one true Christ ranting. Seen a better light in the succession of more moderate churches he'd had to make do with over the last couple of years. I mean, whatever you call God, if you accept that God as your guiding principle the way the Republic does, then any nation that does that has to succeed, right? Has to rise up in the end, no matter what Satan does to lay snares in our path. Wren looked at him thoughtfully. Are you really a Christian? Yes, ma'am. So you believe... Her phone blipped at them. She fished it out and put it to her ear. Yeah, features tautening, the way he'd seen it that morning when the news about the humidity loop came through. Got it. Be right there. She snapped the phone off again. Ward, she said, he's back, and he's pretty fucking pissed off. Pretty pissed off was about right. Scott could hear Ward's bellowing through the metal walls of the con room while they were still at the far end of the corridor. He followed Wren along the narrow space, hurrying to keep up with her curiously long, rapid strides. He would have tried to get ahead of her, to go first in case Nocera was still behaving like an asshole, but there was no room to pass, and anyway. The door sliced back to admit them. Ward's rage boiled out, suddenly on full audio. Scott was used to the sound, but this time he thought there was an edge on the voice he hadn't heard before, something that went well beyond anger. The fucking point of all this planning, if we're... He shut up as he saw them. Ulysses Ward was a big, bearish man, muscular from the constant sub-aqua and surface swimming time the business demanded, balding in a way you didn't see so much on this side of the fence line. He flushed when he got angry, as he was now, and he punctuated his speech with aggressive motion of limbs and head. Scott had never seen him actually hit anyone, but he often gave off the impression that it wasn't entirely out of the question. Nocera, perhaps wisely, had given him centre stage in the con-room, and he stood there now, fists clenched. "We're back," said Wren superfluously. "So I fucking see." Ward seemed to notice Scott for the first time. "You, get down to the sub-dock and take a look at the air scrubbers on Last Man. Felt like I was breathing farts and fumes the last hour back. I nearly fucking had to surface, it got so bad." For about half a second, before he spotted the idiocy of it, Scott thought about refusing to leave Wren until Ward had calmed down. He swallowed instead, said, "Might be a compatibility problem. All that software we took out of, Fel 8 was—" Ward pinned him with a glare. "And can you fix that for me if it is?" "Well, no, but—" "No, that's right. Because I didn't fucking hire you as a software specialist. So why don't you get the fuck down there like I asked you to and take a fucking look at what you can fucking fix for me, all right? Simple enough for you?" Scott looked at him, knowing he was flushing, breathed in hard, nodded on clenched teeth and lips pulled tight. "Good. Then why are you still standing here?" Scott wheeled about and plunged back into the corridor.
fury rising through him like heat. 1 more month, he promised himself silently. 1 more fucking month and out. Before today, he'd thought Ward was okay. He'd thought the man was an American. Guy lost his temper now and then, but what real man didn't? Point was, he knew where the lines were. But now, talking that way, treating Scott like he was some just-over-the-fence liability who'd fucked up, when all the time it was Scott had been warning Ward that if you were going to cannibalize plugins from one sub to another, you couldn't just expect that the systems would fall in love with each other without you ran a whole slew of up-to-date compatibility patches. He was on the stairs down to the dock when he became aware that something had changed fractionally in the light in the corridor behind him. He stopped on the first step, looked back, saw a tall figure advancing down the passageway from the other end, darkening the view along the narrow perspectives as it passed under each overhead bulb and got between Scott and the light source. This guy really was tall, and big with it, and advancing with inexorable calm. Someone not used to being stopped. Someone who must not have liked the signs all over the topside offices that asked you to buzz and take a seat while you waited. One of our staff will be with you shortly. Must instead have decided to come down anyway and find whatever he was looking for. Scott lifted an arm and waved. Hey, he called. The figure gave no indication that it had seen or heard him. It moved steadily along the corridor toward the con-room door, seemed to be wearing a long coat and had one hand held stiffly down inside the folds of the garment. And suddenly, out of nowhere, a lever tipped over in Scott's guts. Something was wrong. This was trouble. He hopped off the step and jogged back up the corridor toward the newcomer. He didn't call out again. There was no point. He knew from experience how voices boomed and echoed in the metal confines of the corridor. This guy had heard him well enough. And yes, there was definitely something in that coat-shrouded hand. He saw the way the material wrapped stiffly around it. He dropped the jog, kicked into a sprint. They met at the door. Scott's sprint died, puddled right out of him. What he had to say dried up in his mouth. He gaped. It was the face. His mind seemed to gibber it. It was the face. The face! Right out of the End Times comics they gave out every fourth Sunday in church, the ones the little kids got nightmares over and the older kids had to earn with red ticks in Pastor William's Book of Deeds. It was the same hollow-cheeked privation and clamped mouth, the long, untidy hair hanging past the hard, angled bones of cheeks and jaw, the same burning eyes. The gaze of judgment. Right out of Volume 2, Issue 63. His knees trembled. His mouth worked. He couldn't. The door hummed. He'd never noticed the noise before now, and slid back. Voices within still angry. The coat swirled. The stranger's right arm came free, came up swinging. Something hit Scott in the side of the head, and he stumbled, went down in an awkward, twisted limb sprawl. Lightning switched through his head, left sparks and a wow and flutter effect in his ears. The gaze lit on him briefly, then swung away again, left and into the opened con-room. The stranger stepped through. Yells erupted, Nocera and Ward almost in unison. "This is private fucking property, asshole! What are you—" A sudden silence that sang above the numbness in his head where he'd been hit. Then Ward again, raw disbelief. "You? What the fuck are you doing in here? What—" Deep, soft cough. A sound he knew from somewhere. And the screaming started. Scott felt the sound wring sweat from his pores, turn his skin shivery ticklish with horror. Like the time Aaron got his arm trapped in the teeth of Dougie Straker's rock breaker, exactly the same feeling, the sound of agony, of damage so massive it ripped register and recognition out of the voice that made it, left only a flayed shriek of denial that could have belonged to anyone, and almost anything. Carmen! Scott flailed about. Panic for her got him to his knees, got him to his feet. He felt blood trickling in his hair. He stumbled and almost fell, braced himself on the edge of the door just as it started to slide closed again. The mechanism trembled against his grip a moment, then gave and sank back to full open. Scott shoved himself upright and staggered through. He had time for one flash-burned glimpse. Blood everywhere. The siren colour of it shocked onto the consoles and wall. What looked like a couple of fistfuls of offal from the discount end of a butcher's counter dripped sliding down the screens. Nocera was down, face turned awkwardly sideways, eyes open, cheek pressed hard to the ill-swept, dusty floor as if he were listening for rats in the understructure. More blood, a broad, wine-dark puddle of it leaking out around his midriff, tongues of the stuff twisting out through the scattered dust. Over his body, Wren and the stranger wrestled for a squat-barreled weapon. Scott made the match with the soft impact he'd heard, one of the Cressy shark-punch guns from the cabinet upstairs. Supposed to be locked. He was always telling Ward that, but Ward lay on his back beyond. More blood again, the big man thrashing and slithering in it, clutching, Scott saw with numb horror, at a raw red hole where his belly had been. Shredded tissue hung in ropes out of him, was clotted on the floor and smeared on his fingers like some red-stained cake mix he'd stuck his hands into. Ward's mouth was a gaping pink tunnel. You could see right down to the molars and a trembling whitish-yellow tongue, and the screams came up out of it in sickening waves. His eyes clawed into Scott as he stood in the doorway, nailed him there, wide and pleading, crazy with pain. Scott couldn't know whether his boss knew him or not. He made to throw himself forward into the fray, threw up instead, with punishing, gut-wrenching force. Vomit splattered in Nocera's pooling blood. Carmen yelled, desperate. Cough of the shark punch. Another impact, this time in his neck, below the ear. He grabbed for something, anything. The floor came up, blood and vomit, warm and wet in his face as he hit. He tried to get his mouth closed or twisted clear, failed in the attempt. The hot acid stink and taste. His stomach flipped again, weakly, his legs flexed like a crippled insect's. Vision dimming out on a pool of red and flecks of yellow-white. He groped after a prayer, fumbled it, couldn't get his mouth to work, made a handful of scrabbling words in his head. Our Father, deliver me not, and black.
Chapter 7. By evening, the news was all bad. Genetic trace turned up a human occupant aboard Hawkins' Pride, unaccounted for by any of the scattered corpses. It wasn't hard to separate out the trace. It came with a full suite of modifications grouped loosely under the popular umbrella term Variant 13, or as Coyle had put it, a fucking twist. They had a manhunt on their hands. Recovered audiovid remained stubbornly the least filled section of the investigation model. There were scant fragments of satellite footage from platforms busy about other business and nowhere near overhead. A weather monitor geosynced to Hawaii had taken some angled peripheral interest when Hawkins' Pride dumped itself into the Pacific, and the RIM's military systems had registered the incursion while the ship was still in the upper atmosphere, but abandoned close interest as the Colin dataheads passed on what they knew. Hawkins' Pride had jettisoned its reactor as part of the emergency re-entry protocols, carried no weapons, and was plotted to land harmlessly in the ocean. One of the Milsats watched the ship complete the promised trajectory and then promptly went back to watching troop movements in Nevada. None of the recovered footage showed any sign of an attempted pick-up prior to the arrival of the coastal cruise, nor were there any helpful images of a lonely figure casting itself into the ocean. None of it was conclusive, even enhanced as far as state-of-the-art optics allowed, but neither did any of it provide anything approaching a useful lead. They had a manhunt on their hands and nowhere to start. In the hotel, Sevgi sat and ate with Norton. Food she didn't want and conversation she wasn't up to. The restaurant's romantic low lighting scheme felt like darkness crowding her eyes at the edges. The sin had crashed, definitively. "How do you feel about this?" Norton asked her, as she picked disinterestedly at an octopus salad. "How do you think?" It was deflection. Something, the only fucking thing, she'd learned from the department-paid counselling sessions after Ethan and the rest of the shit came down. The specialist had sat across the room from her, smiling gently, and pushing back every question she'd asked him with the same infuriating eliciting techniques.
After a while, she started to do the same thing to him. Not helpful, she supposed, but it had brought the sessions to a rapid close, which was what she wanted. "I can't help you if you won't help me," he'd said at the end, an edge of anger finally awake in his soporific, patient voice. He was missing the point. She didn't want to be helped. She wanted to do damage, gashed, red, bleeding, and screaming damage to all and any of the bland facets of social restraint that meshed her about like spiderweb. "Nicholson's probably going to kick," Norton said quietly. "He'll say you're conflicted." "Yeah. Not enjoying your octopus, then?" "I'm not hungry." Norton sighed. "You know we can let this one go if you want, Sev. Tsai's guys don't want us here anyway, and Rimsek would just love the chance to flex its secessional muscle. If this guy didn't drown in the Pacific, he's on their land now. Added to which, the fact he's a 13 pretty much makes it an UNGLA matter. Why don't we just step back and let the UN and the Rim fight it out for jurisdiction?" "No fucking way!" Sevgi tossed her chopsticks onto the plate. She sat back. "I didn't join Colin for an easy ride, Tom. I needed the money is all. And this is as good a way to earn it as busting black market Mars tech or chasing cultists away from the racks. Did you fucking see what he did to those bodies? Helena Larson had a fucking life waiting for her when she got home. This is the first worthwhile thing I've done in over 2 years. This is ours." Norton looked at her in silence for a moment, nodded. "All right. I'll have Tsai upload the CSI files to Colin, New York. That should take the ambiguity out of the situation. What do you want to do about Coyle and Rovio?" "Retain them. Joint task force. Indispensable local law enforcement support." She found energy for a grin. "Should play well with the Rim media. Colin fucks up and spills one of their transports into the Pacific. West Coast cops ride to the rescue. It'll open some doors for us. And save us some legwork." "Well, there's that. You know the Bay Area pretty well, right? Got a sister here?" Norton sipped at his wine. "Sister-in-law. Brother moved over here about 15 years ago. He's a special asylums coordinator with the Human Cost Foundation. You know, screening, social integration program. But it's probably her you heard me talking about. Megan. We get on pretty well." "You going to see them while we're here?" "Maybe." Norton frowned into his drink. "How much of this are we going to let the media have?" Sevgi yawned. "Don't know. See how it goes. If you're talking about the Variant 13 thing, I vote we keep a lid on it." "If I'm talking about the Variant 13 thing? Gee, I don't know. Do you think I could be?" "This is me, Sev. Do you think you could drop the say-what casual act for a while?" She stared off into the gloom of the restaurant. Her eye caught on an underlit motion ad from the 50s, some nanotech dream of change. A ripple of green and blue marches across Martian red to the horizon. A bright new sun rises in synchrony. "It'll be enough to make him out a stowaway and a criminal," she said carefully. "Say that he murdered members of the crew. Keep the details back to screen out all the crank calls we're going to pull down. Bad enough that he's back from Mars. Telling them he's a 13 as well is just asking for trouble. You saw the way Coyle reacted. Remember Sunderson last year? We don't need another abomination among us panic on our hands. You think they'd go that way again, after the spanking they all got from the Press Ethics Commission?" Sevgi shrugged. "The media likes panic. It boosts viewing. Are we going to give race type?" "If and when Organic Trace get it for us, why?" "I'm wondering," Norton said softly, "if he's Chinese." Sevgi thought about it for a moment. "Yeah, there's that. Don't want a replay of Jang fever. That shit was fucking awful. Least with Sunderson, no one died. Apart from Sunderson. You know what I mean. You ever see that lynching footage? They made us watch it in school." Sevgi brushed fingertips to her temples. "I can still see it in here like it was fucking yesterday." "Bad times." "Yeah." She pushed her plate away and bridged her arms in the space it left. "Listen, Tom. Maybe we should run silent on this whole thing. For the time being, anyway. Just tell the media everybody died in the crash, including this guy. It's not like there's a plausibility problem with that, after all.
Shit, we still haven't worked out how he survived. On the other hand, if we get a photo ID off the trace. Big if. Then broadcasting it'd be our best chance of nailing this guy. He can change his face, Tom. Any backstreet salon in the Bay Area'll do it for a couple of $100. By the time we get a face out to the media, he'll have peeled it and gone underground. Gene trace is the only thing that's going to work here. If the gene code is Chinese and that gets out, then you're up against the same problem. But it'll be a specific code we're looking for. It was a specific face they were looking for with Jiang. I don't recall it making much difference. Hell, Sevgi! Out of nowhere, Norton burlesqued Nicholson for her. You know these damn people all look alike anyway. Sevgi smeared a smile. I don't think it's like that out here. This isn't Jesus land. You got idiocy everywhere, Sev. The Republic isn't running the only franchise. Look at Nicholson. New York, born and bred. Where does he get it from? I don't know. Faith Satellite Channel? Hallelujah! Praise the Lord, Jesus gonna come and cut my taxes. They both smirked a little more, but the laughter wouldn't come. The bodies from the virtual still hung around them in the gloom. Presently a busboy came and asked if they were done. Sevgi nodded. Norton asked to see the desserts. The busboy gathered the plates and headed off. It dawned slowly on Sevgi that he was peculiarly gaunt for his age, and that his speech had been oddly patterned, as if it hurt him to talk. His features looked northern Chinese, but his skin was very dark. The realization hit her liquidly in the stomach. She stared after the retreating figure. "Think that's one of your brother's success stories, then?" she asked. Norton followed her gaze. "Oh, doubt it. Statistically, I mean. Jeff told me they get a couple of thousand new black lab escapees a year, minimum, and he's mostly in management anyway, trying to keep the whole thing together. They got nearly 100 counselors working on and off, and they're still swamped. Human costs a charity, right? Yeah. The Rim gives them a budget, and it's not what you'd call generous." A sudden animation flooded her partner's voice. "And then, you know, it's tough work. Kind of thing that wears you down. Some of the stories he's told me about what comes out of those black labs, I don't think I could do it. I don't really understand how Jeff can. It's weird. When we were younger, it always looked like I was going to be the one with the justice vocation. He was the power and influence man, not me. And then," Norton gestured with his wineglass, "somehow he's out here doing charity work and I end up with a big job at Colin. People change." "Yeah. Maybe it's Megan." He looked up sharply. "What is?" "Maybe that was what changed him. When he met Megan." Norton grunted. A waiter came by with a dessert cart, but nothing appealed. They settled for gene-enhanced coffees, for which the place was apparently famous, and the bill. Sevgi found herself staring at the antique Mars Motion ad again. "You know," she said slowly, because they'd both been skating around it all evening, "the real issue isn't who this guy is. The real issue is who helped him get home." "Ah, that. Trick out the fucking ship's gin? If he was capped, and the capsule thawed him, that should have triggered some kind of alarm all by itself, before he even woke up, let alone had time to start hacking the systems. And if he wasn't capped, if he did stow away, then the N-gin wouldn't have allowed the launch in the first place." "You think Coyle and Rovio spotted that? I tried to steer past it." "Yeah, that's happened before on the Mars run. We just don't like to publicize the fact. Sometimes they just die. Nice shot." Norton grinned. "True as far as it goes, Sev." "Yeah. Maybe a dozen times in 60-odd years of traffic. And for my money, you're talking hardware-based failures every time. You don't think they'll bite?" "What? The secret flaws of the N-gin AI?" Sevgi pulled a face. "I don't know. It's got appeal. Machine no match for a human and all that shit. And everyone likes to be let in on a secret. Sell people a conspiracy, their whole fucking brain will freeze up if you're lucky. Baby-eating secret sects. A centuries-old plot to enslave mankind. Black helicopters, flying eggs, shit like that placed to packed houses. Critical faculties out the lock. And meantime,
Sevgi leaned across the table, all humour erased from her face. "We both know that someone else on Mars with some serious machine intrusion skills had a hand in this. Our mystery cannibal was capped along with the others, which means heavy-duty identity fraud, and then he was wired to wake up early, which—" Norton shook his head. "Thing I don't get. Why wake him up so early? He's got to eat everybody else to survive. Why not just trigger the cap a couple of weeks out from Earth?" Sevgi rolled another shrug. "My guess? It was a glitch. Whoever took down the engine wasn't so hot with cryocap specifics. Guy wakes up 2 weeks out from the wrong planet, journey's start, not journey's end. Maybe that shorts out the cryocap so he can't get back in and refreeze. Maybe it doesn't, but he stays out anyway because he can't afford to arrive still capped and go through quarantine. But however you look at it, glitch or no glitch, he had some heavy-duty help. We're not talking about a jailbreak here, Tom. This guy was sent. And that means whoever sent him had a specific purpose in mind." Norton grimaced. "Well, there's a limited number of reasons you'd hire a Variant 13. "Yeah." They were both quiet for a while. Finally, Sevgi looked up at her partner and offered a thin smile. "We'd better find this guy fast, Tom." Chapter 8. He caught the last ferry across the bay to Tiburon, hooked an autocab at the other end and rode out to Mill Valley with the windows cranked down. Warm, green-scented air poured in, brought him a sharp memory of walking under redwood canopies with Megan in Muir Woods. He put it away again with great care, handling the image at the edges like an antique photo he might smudge, or a fragment of broken mirror. He watched the soft glow from passing street lamps and the lights in wood-frame homes built back from the roads, shrouded in foliage. It was as distant from Hawkins' pride and her cargo of carnage as he was currently from home. You looked at the well-kept, scenic, sculpted roadways, all that quiet and residential greenery, and you didn't want to believe that the man who'd crashed into the ocean that morning with only the corpses he'd mutilated for company could be out there under the same night sky. Sevgi Ertekin's words drifted back through his mind, the one intensity of her face as she spoke. "We'd better get this guy fast, Tom." The cab found the address and coasted gently to a halt under the nearest street lamp. Idling there, it made scarcely more noise than the breeze through the trees, but still he saw downstairs lights spring up in the house, and the front door opened. Jeff stood there, framed by the light, waved hesitantly. Must have been waiting at the window. No sign of Megan at his side. Norton walked up the steep curve of the driveway, suddenly feeling the hours and the distance from New York. Cicadas whirred in the bushes and trees planted on either side. Water splashed in the stone bowl fountain at the top. The house stood across the slope in rambling porch-fronted spaciousness. His brother came down the steps to greet him, clapped him awkwardly on the shoulder. "You remembered where to find us, okay?" "Took a taxi." Yeah, right." They went in together. "Megan not about?" he asked casually. "No, she's over at Hillary's with the kids." "Hillary?" "Oh, right, haven't seen you since, Hillary. She's our new legal advisor at the Foundation. Got twins the same age as Jack. They're having a sleepover." Jeff Norton gestured toward the living room. "Come and sit down. Get you a drink?" The room was much the same as Norton remembered it. Battered cloth armchairs facing a fire effect screen set in a raw brick facing. Northwest native art and family photos crowding the walls, polished wood floors and Middle Eastern rugs. Jeff served them vintage Indonesian arak from a bar cabinet made of reclaimed driftwood. Low-level glow from the screen flames and the Japanese-style wall sconces lit his profile as he worked. Norton watched him. "So I guess you saw we made the feeds?" Jeff nodded, pouring. "Yeah, just been looking at it. Colin Death Ship in Mystery Plunge. That's why you're out this way?" "Got it in one. It's a genuine Class 1 nightmare." "Well, I guess you had to start earning that big salary you pulled down sooner or later." A brief, sidelong grin to show it wasn't meant. "Yeah, but somehow, Jeff, it always is, isn't it?" "How are things over at Jefferson Park these days? They treating you well?" Norton shrugged. "Same as it ever was. Can't complain. Got a new partner.
hired out of NYPD homicide. She's a couple of years younger than me, keeps me on my toes. Attractive? Not that it makes any difference, but yeah, she is. Jeff came across with the 2 glasses, handed him one. He grinned. Always makes a difference, little brother. Think you'll nail her? Jeff, for Christ's sake. No real anger. He was too travel-worn and weary for it. Do you really have to act like such a throwback all the time? What? Girl's attractive, you don't do the math, add up your chances. Still standing, his brother knocked back a chunk of the arak, grinned down at him. Come on, I can see it in your eyes. This one you want. Norton pressed thumb and forefinger to his eyelids. You know what, Jeff? Maybe I do and maybe I don't. But it isn't my primary concern right now. You think we could talk about something that matters for a change? He didn't see the way the expression on his brother's face shifted, the way the grin faded out, gave way to a watchful tension. Jeff backed up and dropped into the opposing armchair, thrust his legs out in front of him. When Norton looked at him, he met his gaze and gestured. Okay, Tom, you got it. Whatever I can do. But it's a long time since I had much pull in New York. I mean, I can maybe make some calls if they're on your back, but... No, it's nothing like that. It's not? No, we've pretty much got free rein on this one. Word down from on high, do what you want, but clear up the mess. And what mess would that be, exactly? Feeds say everyone aboard is dead. Yeah. Since when did you trust what you see on the feeds? Truth is, we've got a live one, and he made it off the ship. This is confidential information I'm giving you, Jeff. Can't go any farther than this room. This conversation. Not even Megan. Jeff spread his hands. Slow smile. Hey, since when did I ever tell Megan everything? You know me, Tom. Yeah, well... He held down the anger, old and accustomed, like the kick he got out of the Cadillac when he downshifted without the brake. So, come on. What's the big secret? Big secret is that this guy's a Variant 13. There was a small satisfaction in watching the way Jeff reacted. Eyes widened, mouth dropping to frame a response he didn't have. Norton thought it came off a little phony, but he'd grown used to that aspect of Jeff over the years, the actorly, slightly larger-than-life way he deployed himself for whatever audience there was. He'd always tried to see it, charitably, as the price of admission into the charmed power circle his brother had inhabited with such aplomb when they were both younger men. But now that his brother had apparently become charitable himself without losing any of that mannered polish, Norton was forced to consider that maybe Jeff had always been that way, always playing himself for the cheap seats. You deal with this kind of thing on a daily basis, Jeff, he said simply. I need some advice here. Did you call Ungla? Not yet. Way things are, it's not likely we will. You want my advice? Call him. Come on, Jeff. Colin wouldn't even sign up to the Accords at Munich. You think they're going to want the UN walking over their stuff with big international treaty boots? Jeff Norton set his drink aside on a tall driftwood table, distant cousin to the cabinet. He rubbed hands over his face. How much do you know about Variant 13, Tom? Norton shrugged. What everyone knows. What everyone knows is bullshit hype and moral panic for the feeds. What do you actually know? They're sociopaths. Some kind of throwback to when we were all still hunter-gatherers, right? Some kind of, yeah. Truth is, Tom, it's like the bonobos and the hibernoids and every other misbegotten premature poke at re-engineering that last century's idiot optimist pioneers saddled us with. Guesswork and bad intentions. Nobody ever built a human variant because they thought they were giving it a better shot at life, liberty, and the pursuit of fucking happiness. They were products, all of them, agenda-targeted. Spaceflight programs wanted the hibernoids. The bonobos were patriarchal authority's wet dream of womanhood. Yours too, huh? Jeff gave him a crooked grin. Are you ever going to let that go? Would Megan? Megan doesn't know. It's my problem, not hers. That's big of you. No, it's weak and masculine of me. I know that. Guess I'll just never have your moral fucking rectitude, little brother. But telling Megan isn't going to achieve anything except hurt her and the kids, and I won't do that." He picked up his glass again and lifted it in Norton's direction. "So here's to living with your mistakes, little brother. Either that or fuck you very much." Norton shrugged and raised his own glass. "Living with your mistakes." And Megan flitted through his mind. Sun-splashed hair and laughter amid the redwood trunks, and later, naked body sun-dappled and straining upward to press against him on the sweat-damp sheets of the motel bed. "So," he said, to drive out the vision, "if the bonobos were patriarchal authority's wet dream, what does that make Variant 13? "Variant 13? Jeff gave him the crooked grin again. "Variant 13 gave us back our manhood." "Oh, come on." "Hey, you weren't there, little brother." "You're 6 years older than me, Jeff. You weren't there either." "So go read the history books. You don't want to trust what your big brother tells you? I'm talking pre-secession, pre-atmosphere on Mars. You got a first world where manhood's going out of style. Advanced wave of feminized society. The alpha males culling themselves with suicide and super-virility drugs their hearts can't stand, which in the end is suicide, just slower and a bit more fucking fun. I thought they criminalized that stuff." Jeff gave him a crooked grin. "Oh yeah, and that worked. I mean, no one takes drugs once they're illegal, right? Especially not drugs that give you a hard-on like a riot baton, and all-night-long instant replay. I still don't believe that stuff tipped any kind of balance. That's talk show genetics, Jeff." "Suit yourself. The academic jury's still out on the virilist side. You're right about that much. But I don't know a single social biologist who doesn't count alpha male self-destruct as one of the major influences on the last century's political landscape. Shrinking manhood," the grin again, "so to speak. And right along with that, you've got a shrinking interest in military prowess as a function of life. Suddenly, no one but dirt-poor idiots from Kansas wants to be a soldier, because hell, that shit can get you killed, and there have got to be better and better paid ways to live your life. So you got these few dirt-poor idiots fighting tooth and nail for causes," Jeff's voice morphed momentarily into a gruff Jesus-land parody, "they don't understand real good. But generally speaking, the rest are screaming human rights abuse and let me out of here. Where's my ticket through college? And we are losing, little brother, all the way down, because we're up against enemies who eat, sleep, and breathe hatred for everything we represent, who don't care if they die screaming so long as they take a few of us with them. See, a feminized, open-access society can do a lot of things, Tom. But what it can't do worth a damn is fight wars in other people's countries." "I didn't ask for a class on the secession, Jeff. I asked you about Variant 13. "Yeah, getting there." Jeff took another chunk off his arak. "See, once upon a time we all thought we'd send robots to fight those wars. But robots are expensive to build, and down where it counts, no one really trusts them. They break down when it gets too hot, or too cold, or too sandy. They fuck up in urban environments, kill the wrong people in large numbers, bring down infrastructure we'd really rather keep intact. They can be subverted, hacked, and shut down with a halfway decent black market battlefield deck run by some tech-smart data hawk we probably trained ourselves on a big-hearted, arms-around-the-fucking-world scholarship program at MIT. Robots can be stolen, rewired, sent back against us without us knowing it. You remember that memorial stone Dad showed us, that time we drove down to New Mexico? That big fucking rock in the middle of Oklahoma?" "Vaguely." He had a flash on a big, pale granite boulder sheared on one side and polished on that single surface to a high grey gloss that clashed with the rough, matte finish of the rest of the stone. Letters in black he was too young to read. Arid, failing farmland, a couple of stores on a sun-blasted highway straight as a polished steel rail. An old woman behind the counter where they bought candy, hair as grey as the stone outside. Sad, he remembered. She looked sad as they chose and paid. I was, 5 or 6? If that. I guess it would have gone right over your head, but I had nightmares for a couple of weeks after that. This Trupex AS-81, straight out of an old toy set I had, but full size, smashing into the house, flattening Mom and Dad, standing over my bed, pulling me out and ripping my arms and legs out of their sockets. You know those fucking machines sat in that storage depot for 9 weeks before the Allahu Akbar virus kicked in?
Yeah, I read about it in school. Like I said, Jeff, I'm not here for a history lesson.
They massacred the whole fucking town, Tom. They tore it apart. There's nothing left there except that fucking rock.
I know. Hardesty, Fort Stewart, Bloomsdale, the Marine base at San Diego, all in less than 3 years. Are you surprised the military went looking for a better option?
Variant 13.
Yeah, Variant 13. Pre-civilized humans.
Everything we used to be. Everything we've been walking away from since we planted our first crops and made our first laws and built our first cities. I'm telling you, Tom, if I were you, I'd just call in Ungla and stand well back. You do not want to fuck about with 13s.
Now you sound like the feeds. Jeff leaned forward, face earnest.
Tom, 13 is the only genetic variant Jacobson thought dangerous enough to abrogate basic human rights on. There's a reason those guys are locked up or exiled to Mars. There's a reason they're not allowed to breed. You're talking about a type of human this planet hasn't seen in better than 20,000 years. They're paranoid psychotic at base, glued together with from childhood military conditioning and not much else. Very smart, very tough, and not much interested in anything other than taking what they want, regardless of damage or cost.
I fail to see, said Norton acidly, how that gives us back our manhood.
That's because you live in New York.
Norton snorted and drained his arrack. His brother watched with a thin smile until he was done.
I'm serious, Tom. You think secession was about Pacific Rim interests and the Green Agenda? Or maybe a few lynched Asians and a couple of failed adventures in the Middle East?
Among other things, yeah, it was.
Jeff shook his head. That wasn't it, Tom. None of it was. America split up over a vision of what strength is. Male power versus female negotiation. Force versus knowledge. Dominance versus tolerance. Simple versus complex. Faith, flag, and patriotic song stacked up against the new math, which, let's face it, no one outside quantum specialists really understands, cooperation theory, and the new international order. And until Project Lawman came along, every factor on the table was pointing toward a future so feminized it's just downright un-American.
Norton laughed, despite himself.
You should be writing speeches, Jeff.
You forget, his brother said unsmilingly.
I used to.
Now, think about the situation the way it was back then. The sinking ship of heartland masculinity, bogged down abroad in complexities it can't understand, failed by its military technology and its own young men. And then you put these new, big, kick-ass motherfuckers into American uniforms. You call them the lawmen. And suddenly, they're winning. No one knows exactly where they've come from all of a sudden. There's a lot of deniability going around, but whoever gave a shit about that? What counts is that these guys are American soldiers. They're fighting for us, and for once they're carrying the battle. You just sit there a moment, Tom, and you think what effect that had in all those little towns you just flew over to get here. Jeff lowered the stabbing finger he had leveled on his brother, looked into his glass, and raised his eyebrows, maybe at his own sudden gust of passion. That's the way I read it anyway.
This is the end of the CD. The program continues on the next CD.